Welcome, everyone. This is the sixth webinar in our BE.Hour Webinar Series, talking all things behavioral science, particularly behavior-centered design, which is one of RARE's and the Center for Behavior and the Environment's frameworks for how to implement a behaviorally based solution to conservation and environmental issues. So we're really excited that you're here. Just briefly, I will go over what was discussed in the last BE.Hour session, which was really fantastic. If you want to see a recording of that, it's on our website, and I will put the link in the chat in a little bit. But last time we had one of our B Center colleagues, Katie Williamson, talking about RARE's 6 behavioral levers, which are a really, really fun and engaging and super useful tool for actually implementing solutions and determining what kinds of solutions you are going to implement. So Katie reviewed sort of the who, what, where, when, why, and particularly of note why using multiple behavioral levers is really important to creating lasting change. We were also joined by Michelle Metzler from the Recycling Partnership, who talked about how a variety of levers have been used in TRP's various initiatives, particularly to help reduce contamination in curbside recycled materials, which was really great. And then we broke off into a very cool question and answer session and concluded. So again, that recording is on our website. I will put it in the chat in a second. Today's speakers are 2 other B Center friends. We have Kate Mantle joining us from Seattle, Washington, on the West Coast of the United States, and Sanya Ashraf joining us from San Francisco, California, also on the West Coast of the United States. And I'll let them further introduce themselves and their roles in their own respective presentations. But really quickly, I want to talk about the objectives for today's session. So it's all about testing a solution and receiving feedback, right? So the objectives are consequently, to identify why testing a solution prototype is a really key step in the BCD or behavior-centered design journey. Learn why receiving feedback is really critical prior to investing a lot of time, effort, etc., in scaling your efforts. We're going to see an example from Sanya of how RARE's research and development team has tested a solution and received valuable feedback in their own work. Then we'll break out into breakout rooms, and we'll have one room for with Kate leading that room, where you can discuss anything about sort of the theory of asking for feedback and testing a solution prototype. Sanya will also have a breakout room where you can discuss the application of those. Some people in the registration had questions, so if you wrote in with questions, please feel free to ask those questions during those breakout rooms. And then finally, I will put some links in the chat so that you know where to find resources on behavior-centered design, particularly on our website, which is behavior.rare.org. 2 quick things before we begin. If you are located in the United States, which a lot of folks are, we are having a really cool one-day summit about all things behavioral science, particularly that will explore how behavioral insights have been applied to achieve environmental impacts. This is an in-person summit in Washington, D.C. I will put also the registration for that in the chat. So if that's of any interest, we really encourage you to attend. Again, that's June 11th. And then lastly, again, behavior.rare.org is the website for the B Center, and that is full of resources, including tools, worksheets, case studies, all things for how we can implement behavior-centered design and those 6 behavioral levers in our work. And so I will put that in the chat, but we highly encourage you, if you have not already, to make an account on behavior.rare.org, a free account. You will not be sorry. There's a lot of really cool stuff on there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who is going to start us off on our presentation for today. Kate.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Kate Mantle. I'm the Director of Training Programs for the Center for Behavior Environment at RARE. I'm going to share about one of my favorite steps in the behavior-centered design process. And so what we at the B Center call the test step. So at this point in our BCD journey, you'll have framed the problem by selecting a behavior actor pair, hopefully done some research to empathize with your target actors, created a hypothesis about which barriers and motivations are driving the current behavior and which you think might drive the desired behavior. and then brainstormed some solutions and created a prototype. So before we launch an intervention at scale, and next slide, Maria. Before we launch an intervention at scale and sink a lot of resources into it, we want to do some testing. So ideally with our target actors and audiences, it's really valuable to gain feedback from at least a few members of your audience. You'll want to also consider if your testing group is representative of your audience. So how do we think about this step? So usually this looks like presenting your solution idea to a focus group. Maybe you're running a simulation, maybe you're doing a mini scale pilot, conducting additional interviews or surveys. Some of the principles here that we like to think about during the step are really just around, how are you getting feedback on your idea, on your prototype in a real world setting? And then some diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations for this step. Again, thinking about representation, who you're getting feedback from, consider the impact or potential harms of your test or your pilot, and then always try to consult with local stakeholders about what's appropriate for getting feedback. And at this point, you'll have collected, hopefully, so much information about your audience during your empathize step. And we know you've been careful to link your intervention to specific behavioral strategies. All of that may be true, and kudos to you for doing all of that hard planning work upfront in the behavioral design process. But even the best designs can perform unpredictably in the real world. Maybe we miss something in our empathize step that's actually really important to driving the behavior. So this is a place where we kind of stop, take a step back from our beloved designs and solutions, and try to look objectively through the eyes of our actors and audience. Next slide, Maria. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 important reasons why you should always test your prototype. So 1, ultimately, testing saves you time once your solution has launched. It can take a while to get good data on what is and isn't working. And we see that testing allows you to collect information about where your solution might not be working as well as it could be before you spend those, money and resources launching it. And then, so that brings me to reason number 2. So testing your solution provides valuable information that you wouldn't, you wouldn't release a novel without proofreading it for typos. And that's the same is true for your behavioral solution. So testing allows you to fine tune your prototype based on the feedback from the people for whom you're designing. Number 3, testing is an important opportunity to fail on a small scale. Sometimes we miss the mark. That's okay. We try to fail fast, fail forward. Testing helps us find that before we go out in public with our solution, and depending on how we miss the mark, we may even have to go all the way back to one of our other steps in the behavior-centered design process. We may go back to empathize. We may even have to go back and reframe the problem or how we're thinking about this after the step. So no one likes starting over or starting from scratch, but if our goal is to generate effective, beneficial solutions, sometimes we have to, and we'd rather know that now before we get to the later steps in the process. Number 4, testing can help build trust. So it provides that extra step to go back to your audience and show them that you're listening to them and value their input. So you've listened to them in the empathize step, you've taken that into account. In some cases, you may even be co-designing with them in the process, if that's applicable in your context. And I think just having this time to step back and get additional input is really important. So finally, I'm just going to leave you with a quick example of testing in action. Testing can look really different depending on your project, your program, the scale at which you're designing for. And I always like to emphasize that it doesn't have to cost a lot. You can do this really simply. Usually the biggest cost is people's time. And so here's an example from Manor House Agricultural Center in Kitale, Kenya. So they were designing to promote trainings in biointensive agriculture to local farmers. So they did their empathize step, they created a hypothesis, they drafted 3 different versions for a billboard to promote their trainings. Next slide. So before making the final billboard, they conducted a focus group test with 5 farmers to understand whether their intended messages about the benefits of agriculture came across in their slogan artwork and supporting messages. And you can see on the wall here, they were just using, they made their original designs, their 3 designs with flip chart paper and markers. They had their draft slogans written up here. And this was a really critical step. Because the farmers then, next slide, the farmers helped the designers understand what a wealthy farm would look like to them. So, for example, the wealthy farmers would have a fish pond and a fence around their crops to keep out the wild animals. And it's these kind of details that can then help the audience to see themselves in the solution, or sort of the desired end state of the solution. And the Manor House team then worked with a local artist to revise the designs before they actually went and painted it and produced the billboard. Next slide. So, 9 months after installing the billboard, the Manor House team had tripled its training enrollments. And of course, this example doesn't have a control condition. So, we don't know how successful the billboards would have been without the pond or the fencing depicted, but we do know that those elements in particular spoke to the farmers, and they would not have been included in the design if Manor House hadn't gone ahead and tested their prototype solution back with the audience. So some food for thought there. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Sonia, who's going to talk about another example of how you might test your solution.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. I am Sanya. I am a senior research scientist with the B Center, and today I'm going to talk to you about something that's in the field right now that we're testing, and this is really exciting to talk about because you'll hear almost real-time feedback that we got yesterday. So next slide. This project, just before I start talking about the project, I'll just recap what you heard. At the B Center, we do testing a lot. Again, like Kate, this is my favorite step. It gives you an opportunity to show it to the real world audience and check if it meets the needs of the end users. Oftentimes we work in an office at a desk and we imagine that this is what needs to be shown, this is what needs to be said in this way, but it's not. You have to test it with somebody who is part of the audience to make sure that it's resonating the way you need it to be. And obviously, every time you will have some feedback, and it's up to you to see if it's worth going back to the iteration step of the prototyping, or do an in-house test and move forward. The methods that we use to do this can be both qualitative and quantitative, which Kate has already touched upon, and we can discuss more in the breakout groups. But a lot of the testing can look like user interviews, focus groups, or even observing how a user interacts with a platform. There are also quantitative approaches where you do A/B testing. So you show a group one version of it, another group another version of it, and check the impact on the outcome that you're looking for. Next slide. So today's example is from our program, Fish Forever. We're doing Fish Forever is a program that RARE has in over 60 countries, and its focus is to empower communities to protect and sustainably manage fisheries. So we work very closely with the community to shift practices so that they take on challenges and protect their livelihoods and ecosystems. So you can imagine there's a lot of behavior change activities, a lot of SPCC materials that we use to make sure that people behave a certain way, or they really react to the activity materials in a way that makes them take certain actions. Next slide. What we are, the case study that I'll talk about is testing a rapid data collection tool. So this program has a series of activities that we roll out over, let's say, a long time, a year. And oftentimes programs like this will do a baseline and an end line at the end of the year. But what we're trying to develop is a more spot assessment. So we are trying to get people to respond to a survey on their phone. So this, few of my colleagues and me, we are testing an SMS or a call survey that we can send to the Fisher folks' phones. And what this will help us do is to reach especially hard to reach audiences whom we might miss in the survey and who might even have the most basic mobile phones, but will be able to respond to our questions. Next slide. Obviously in the BCD steps, there are the empathize steps. Before we did the prototyping, some of the insights that we gathered that was relevant in the prototyping was understanding the audience, which fed into our a design process. And these are important, and you know it, and you've probably already done them, but I'm linking them up here just to give you a sense of what went into the prototyping. So we had to understand what the mobile literacy of Fisher folks are in these communities. Who uses the phone? Is it the Fisher? Is it the Fisher's wife? Is it their teenage daughter? It would really affect who's answering these surveys, because obviously we can't see who's holding the phone. What other apps do they use? What their language preferences are? And oftentimes there are legal and ethical considerations in sending out surveys and asking questions, privacy issues, etc. And there's a lot of back-end program capability programming that we also took into account. Next slide. So before any testing, what I would recommend is an in-house testing. Your colleagues who've never seen what you're doing are great resources. I know there was a point about costs. Before you go engage the audience, you should test it with your colleagues. And they are really good and easy way to get first eyes on your product. So for example, these are some examples of what we showed our colleagues who had no idea what we were doing, and they had really good insights about, hey, why are you I don't like this intro message, why don't you say this instead of that, what does this mean? So we changed a lot of the text based on this. And obviously this platform does a series of tests, and when we asked them to test it out, there were errors that broke down the system very fast, even before we went to the field. So I think in-house testing is something that I'll kind of press on, and I think it'll be really helpful if you have colleagues who are game to give you some honest feedback at a very early stage. Next slide. And then we go into the field, we find representative Fisher folks. Again, this is the qualitative way that we did this was holding a focus group. This model is called build, measure, and learn cycle. So this prototyping of specifically our product is an iterative process. So we test it, we note down all the findings that we found, we go back to the desk, correct it, and then test it again. For a focus group, I'll just point out some key points. Who you pick as a facilitator is really important. Obviously, in a lot of settings, there's a different language. Make sure your facilitator speaks the language and picks up on nuances from anybody they're interacting with. The team worked really closely together to make a focus group guide. What exactly are we looking out for in the testing? What feedback do we want? So the facilitator had a step-by-step process of how to get that feedback. Obviously, selecting the right audience is important. Again, for a focus group, we recommend 8 to 10 people. More than that, it's hard to navigate what's going on in a focus group. But to the point that the participants have to reflect the audience that you're interested in. So we found people with different comfort levels using phones, different types of phones. We went into different municipalities, which might have different phone coverages, etc. So you have to really think about who your audience is and what are the dimensions you need to reflect to get the feedback. In addition to the focus group, just one more point, Maria. We also did a one-on-one user experience. So very early after the first focus group, we realized that a lot of people were quiet, especially the ones who were struggling. And after that, we said, hey, like we'll do a focus group again, but maybe what we'll do is one-on-one user experience, which is like an interview. Hey, why don't you test this out? I'll sit with you and see what you're doing, just taking the individual out of the focus group to make sure we got their feedback. And that's something that you might also find if you're testing a certain kind of product. Next. These photos are blurry, but I'll just say what's happening in them. Um, the first photo shows that this person texted the platform many times and nothing happened. And the second one is saying Bisaya, which is the language. Like this person was saying, I want the language to be Bisaya, and nothing happened. So I'm just saying these are great. We love problems like this because this is very easy to solve, but also this can happen to anybody. Next slide. I'll give you some examples of what we found. The SMS messages, for example, in our first test was not received in sequence. So for example, the introduction SMS didn't go through, but the survey question went through first, then the introduction came, which you can imagine confused the participant. And the reason for this was the network quality, where, what telco company the phone was connected to. We tested a few languages. So Tagalog, this is the Philippines. So Tagalog was one of the languages, Bisaya was another, and obviously English was an option. And across the board, the local, hyperlocal language of Bisaya was chosen. So we've decided to go forward with that. We also found insights of the compensation process. People were like, hey, I'm happy to respond to the survey, but who's gonna texting takes money, who's gonna compensate me? And this is a dimension we were like, oh, it's so cheap, they'd be willing to participate in it, but it's giving us good insight that we should include a note about compensation in the introduction or figure out a way to make sure this is addressed in the future iterations. We also had a voice call survey where we recorded messages over voice and tested it with the same participants, and this was preferred by far instead of reading. But the answers they had to give were also voice recorded, and there were some concerns about privacy, that somebody might hear their responses, somebody might identify their voices. How do we deal with that? We also found some contextual things which were interesting. Fishers are obviously in the sea most times, so the phone is not always with them. So we learned interesting but critical things like when to send out messages, maybe during meal times when they come back home, they're looking at their phone. And then trust building, I think I saw that already in the chat. For people to answer surveys, they really have to trust you, because text messages, can be spam, can be unrelated to anything that you're doing. So we have to incorporate something beforehand to make sure they're expecting it and they trust who's sending it. Yeah, so next slide. I'll just end with these very basic points, but very important. When you're testing, especially in iterative testing, I think rapid sharing of data with the design team is really important. If you send a team out to the field, find ways that they can summarize the findings and send it back to you if you're not there in person or some parts of your team is not there. So in this case, we sent screenshots of the user experience, we recorded and summarized discussions right after the session. And another thing we did is that, every focus group only gets 10 people together. We included a question that allows them to project to how other people would also, or what they think other people would do in a setting like this. So we asked participants, think about other fisher folks you interact with, what are the concerns they would have if we included them in this focus group? And a lot of insights came out, oh, they won't be able to do it, or this is too hard. We found that a lot of people were opened up about concerns when we asked them to project what people like their neighbors or friends would do if they got this survey. And again, every issue at this point is helpful. This is failing forward. Every time we got an issue, there was a cheer around the room, like, yes, we found it now, rather than in 3 months when it would be scaled up. And there's no, it's more expensive to correct and takes a lot more time. And one thing that maybe we can get into in the discussion groups, always look out for additional concerns not directly related to the test case. So contextual factors are something that you have to take into account that you haven't thought about, which is maybe not directly related to the design, but it's important to take. Make sure it's incorporated. Always iterate with new participants, new representative participants. It's hard to get the same kind of people in the group. They will know the problems and focus on the same problems again. So broaden out your groups, and when you go back to the field again, include new participants. And encourage open feedback mechanisms. This can look very different for different settings. Some people might not be very honest in a focus group setting. Some people might be better in an interview setting. If it's a digital feedback, just figure out what will enable people to talk to you and give you the feedback you need. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to discuss any part of this in the group.